Welcome back. In this video, I'm going to introduce the concept of indirect proof. And up to this point, we have been doing our two-column proof and proving things in a direct manner. So we are given some information, and then we are going to use that information to prove something to be true. So we've done the chain of reasoning, the A implies B, and B implies C, and C implies D. Thus, we can logically conclude that A implies D. So we've been proving things in a direct manner. To prove things indirectly, given only two possible conclusions, what we end up doing is we prove one of the conclusions not possible. So by given only two possible conclusions, essentially we're saying that either something's perpendicular or it's not perpendicular. Two segments are either congruent or they're not congruent. Something's an altitude or it's not an altitude. So that type of thing would be our two possible conclusions. Okay? So if we prove one of the conclusions not possible, well, then the only other logical option is that the other possibility has to be true. There's no third choice here. So, indirect proof. Again, everything has that we're going to be dealing with anyway will have two possible conclusions. Okay? As I mentioned before, something's either congruent or not congruent. Something's perpendicular or not perpendicular. Something's a bisector or not a bisector. Okay? Something's a midpoint or it's not a midpoint. It's a median or it's not a median. Okay? So you also notice we're using the negation. Something's congruent or it's not congruent. So that's going to be an important part of this as well. So that's how we're going to start our two-column proofs, or our indirect proofs here. Normally, we have been given a given and a proof, and we work from the givens, and we head down to what we're trying to prove. But now, we're going to take our desired conclusion, and we're actually going to start with that. Okay? But we're going to start with the negation of it, or the opposite of it. Okay? And I'll get to the sample in just a minute. But we're going to begin our proof with the opposite of what we want to prove. Normally, if we have a given and a proof, and we do our two-column proof, right? The proof, whatever we're trying to prove, that's going to be our last step. Okay? But now, in an indirect proof, this is going to be our first step, but it's going to be the opposite. So we might be given a proof really that is going to be something like AB is not perpendicular to BC. And our first step now will be the negation of that, or AB is perpendicular to BC. So that's how we're going to start our proofs. We're going to take what is normally our last step, and we're going to take the negation of it, and it's going to be our first step. That's where we're going to begin. And the reason we're going to use here is assume the negation of the desired conclusion. So our desired conclusion is that AB is not perpendicular to BC. So we're going to start with the opposite of that. I know it's a little unusual, it's a little counterintuitive, but when we go through the process, you'll see how that works. So that's how we'll begin, and then we'll continue on and use our givens and the other information, and we'll write a two-column proof. Okay? So we write our two-column proof, starting with essentially the proof, the opposite of the proof. And as we are writing our two-column proof, suddenly we'll come across a contradiction. Something unusual will happen that doesn't make sense. Okay? A given will be violated. We'll come up and we'll say, hey, wait a minute, our logical conclusion in our proof says one thing, but given says the opposite. So a given will be violated. Or some theorem or definition or other fact will come up that doesn't make sense. That would also be violated or found to be not true. So when that happens, then our proof is kind of collapsed under our assumption. And if it collapses, then we know that our assumption that we started with is false. So that leads us to the final conclusion that the remaining possibility, the opposite of what we started with, must be true. So we have to state the remaining possibility. So remember, we started with AB is perpendicular to BC, and what happened is we found this to be false. Okay, therefore, the only other possibility is AB is not perpendicular to BC. That must be true if this AB is perpendicular to BC is false. Okay, so now this final phrase is going to be worth approximately 5 points, and you'll say whatever previous statement in your 2-column proof, it violates a given. Therefore, our assumption is false. Our assumption was essentially step 1, what we started with. Thus, whatever we're trying to prove has to be true. This will make a little bit more sense when we complete a sample problem, which is just coming up next. So let's begin our sample problem here, our sample of an indirect proof. And it appears that Bob and Ryan were here. We've had a little visitor. So our proof, we're given that circle O, and we're given that AB is not congruent to BC. And we're trying to prove that angle AOB is not congruent to angle COB. So we want to prove that these two angles here are not congruent. Okay, and that you'll see quite often in indirect proofs, you'll have these not perpendicular, not congruent, so then you kind of know that this is going to be an indirect proof problem. So instead of proving that angle AOB is not congruent to angle COB, what we're going to prove is that angle AOB congruent to angle COB isn't going to be possible. And it's a subtle difference, I know. But if angle AOB is congruent to angle COB is impossible, then the only other option is that angle AOB is not congruent to angle COB. So we're not going to directly prove these not congruent. What we're going to prove is that it's impossible to prove them congruent. So thus we're indirectly proving what we want. So let's take a look at this. In our notes we talked about we begin with the opposite of what we want to prove. This really is step 1 in our proof now. It's not the last step, but it's the first step. And we're going to start with the opposite of that. So our first step is that angle AOB is congruent to angle COB. Now we don't know that for sure. We're making an assumption here. So we are assume the negation of our desired conclusion. That's our desired conclusion. And then we go on and we just write a 2-column proof. Okay? Well, I'm going to stay away from the not congruence here for a minute. I'm going to mark my diagram. We're saying that AOB is congruent to COB. And this is a circle, so that I know that Well, I'll write my given in. Circle O is given. So then I also know that OA is congruent to OB. And that is because the radii of a circle are congruent. So I'll go ahead and mark my diagram. Those are congruent. And, well, I've got options here. I can say BO is reflexive and prove these two triangles congruent by side angle side. I can go all the way across, and I can say angle A is congruent to angle C, and then get those two triangles congruent by angle side angle. So we've got some options here for step 4. I'm just going to say that angle A is congruent to angle C by if sides of an isosceles triangle are congruent, then the base angles must be congruent. And now my triangles are congruent by angle side angle. So I've got triangle AOB is congruent to triangle COB. Yes, I have my letters right. And that was angle side angle, steps 1, 3, and 4. Well, if those two triangles are congruent, then we know AB is congruent to CB, or AB is congruent to BC. So I'm going to write that down. AB is congruent to CB by CPCTC. Well, wait a minute. That's a problem because it's given to us that AB is not congruent to BC. That's a fact. Okay, that's not what we're trying to prove. That's a fact. That's known. That has to be true. Well, that's our contradiction. This step right here is our contradiction. So contradiction has arisen. We violated a given. So we would say that this contradicts a given. And I can just do this in paragraph form. This contradicts a given. Well, that must mean that our original assumption, what we started with, has to be false. Okay? So our assumption, thus, our assumption, back in step 1, and you don't have to write this, but that's what it is. Our assumption, step 1, is false. So we have proven that AOB is not congruent to COB. This is false, therefore, our only possible conclusion is that angle AOB is not congruent to angle COB. So we have indirectly proven this. Now this final step here, this is a reason in proof. I will expect you to kind of memorize this pattern. That we have a contradiction of a given or some other definition, thus our assumption is false, therefore, and then your final conclusion. And that will be probably worth about 5 points. That's a 5-point step right there. So it's going to be worth your while to memorize that and get that pattern down. And we'll get more practice on indirect proof when I see you in class.